literally you and I sat down last week in San Francisco, and since we sat down, we've seen 4.1 be released, O3 be released, 4 mini be released from OpenAI. We've seen Flash 2.5 from Gemini be released, right? All these releases that basically happened last week. It's kind of crazy, in the world of LLMs, that how synced up these guys are at releasing at the same time.
Good morning, Sam. How are you?
I'm good, Matt. I'm back in Singapore, so I survived the 17-hour flight back.
Last time, Sam, we did the video on needing to go beyond the models and actually talking about the ecosystems around the models, things like cost or agent strategy or reliability, right? Or enterprise fit, right? At scale, and these sorts of things that are really going to drive the decisions from people in the enterprise when they're thinking about using these models, right? So we started that last week. So this week we wanted to come back and talk about what these latest announcements mean for those two ecosystems and where they both come out. I'm going straight to that point number one, which is what Google wins on the compute economics. And this is flowing from the story that I wrote last week that got a lot of traffic. These various elements where Google has really emerged over the last year to bring everything together. And so on the compute economics, Google leverages TPUs, right? Giving it a cost per performance advantage, based on current API pricing. But basically, let's call it what it is. O3 from OpenAI is significantly more expensive than Google's Gemini 2.5 Pro. It's roughly 4 times as expensive for output and 8 times as expensive for standard input on a per token basis, right? So it basically, and that's because I would posit that Google's leveraging its custom TPUs. And it announced its Ironwood TPU, right? Which basically gives it these cost for performance advantages on an intelligence per dollar basis. And OpenAI has to rely on NVIDIA GPUs, right? And NVIDIA is taking, it's the biggest market cap company on the planet right now. It's obviously got profit margins in those GPUs. And so OpenAI is having to face that higher cost. And I think that's going to be a big issue going forward. Would you agree?
Oh, totally. We've talked about this before, and I really do feel that the TPU is Google's secret weapon. Especially after just coming back from the Bay Area and talking to, different engineers that are working at different companies, you realize that a lot of the talent is moving around, right? So I don't think there's a huge moat at the moment in talent. I the thing that people have got the moat, and really it's Google who's got this moat, is this ability to be able to get the sort of levels of compute at sort of 20% of the cost. Because if you think about it, that's sort of like, NVIDIA is basically making these GPUs for sort of 20% of what they actually cost. And then they've got that NVIDIA tax, that NVIDIA markup, whatever you want to call on it, that OpenAI and that every other player is having to pay for. Google's not having to pay for that. The crazy thing, though, is they are paying for it because the Google Cloud is so big. They are one of NVIDIA's top customers, just because they've got a lot of customers who want to, who still want to use the NVIDIA stuff. But when we're talking about Gemini, that's all TPU, right? That's running on TPUs. That's, being trained on TPUs. And I think, we're talking mostly today about sort of inference costs. But you got to think that as the models sort of go to the next level each time, those training costs are getting an order of magnitude bigger each time.
Right.
And so, if we saw sort of like, everyone freak out that, okay, DeepSeek in China was so much cheaper, than OpenAI, and then Anthropic came out, and I think they were sort of saying it's tens of millions to train Sonnet or whatever. If we go an order of magnitude bigger than that, we're now starting to get to the $100 million models. And maybe, not too far distance, we're looking at maybe close to $1 billion kind of model. So at that stage, you've got to think that Google is by far ahead. I think one of their biggest challenges probably at the moment is just manufacturing these as fast as possible.
So to cap this point, it's a big one. Google's likely to offer enterprise better long-term, total cost of ownership, predictability, right? OpenAI's costs there's some question marks, right, around its relationship with NVIDIA, relationship with Microsoft, in the GPU market and Azure. Okay, so point number two, Google's open protocols, right? You could we argue that they're allowing for more interoperability? Again, Google has things like A to A, right, protocol, this new agent to agent protocol it announced last at its Google Cloud Next event, the ADK, and then Agent Space, which is this hub where enterprise companies can actually keep their agents, their employees allowed to discover agents, developers allowed to build agents, pull in agents from the outside. OpenAI is focused on integration with its own stack and having that control, right?
I would push back on this. I think Google's way ahead in the hardware game with the GPUs. I don't see that they're hugely ahead with the sort of agent frameworks and stuff like that. And the A to A protocol, I really think that's all up in the air at the moment, right? We know that Anthropic hasn't signed on to do this. We've seen, even people from LangChain and stuff sort of question parts of it and stuff like that on Twitter. So, let's see. I think there are a lot of really good ideas in the A to A thing, but if Anthropic comes out and says, "No, no, no, we're not gonna support that. We're just gonna extend MCP," you got to think that most developers now are really on the MCP bandwagon. They're probably going to go that direction rather than stick with Google's one. Where I think Google could get a sort of foothold with this A2A stuff is actually one of the things we spoke to Richard Sirota about was the whole idea of an agent app store. Some other things that we didn't sort of touch on and really surprisingly weren't talked about more at Google Cloud Next were things like Agent Engine. So you can actually run agents in the cloud on Google Cloud and the whole agent garden that they're sort of setting up. Those sorts of things, if Google can be the sort of the first one to offer an agent sort of app store experience, I think that would be really big because then they're actually going to get, I think most developers trust Google for payments and things like that. We know that they've had the Play Store, which has been very successful for a long time. They've got a good track record of sort of building, something which allows you to sell something on their platform and make money out of it. So that could be a really big deal. The question is, how far off is that?
Right.
So yeah, I would say on point one, yeah, Google's massively ahead with the hardware. On point two, ADK is looking good. Agent space still up in the air. Let's see. And A2A definitely, that one is really going to come down a lot to Anthropic and what devs believe is going to be best for them.
Yeah, yeah. And I had reached out to Anthropic for comment as well, as you know, and they had basically come back and said no comment. So they're clearly not on board with A to A yet. You're right to push back, Sam. I mean, you're closer on to the actual agent development space. Doesn't look like there's been a lot of pickup, at least from my perspective. It sounds like you're saying the same thing on the A to A, at least from their approach. While Google didn't necessarily go to Anthropic or potentially LangChain or others to really work with them on the A to A protocol and get their buy-in per se, it does look like they are at least pushing for interoperability, and maybe that's a necessary play. Obviously, it's critical for enterprise pickup. But when you look at OpenAI, they seem to be really using O3 with the tools, making it a really efficient user of tools, and so it seems like OpenAI is focusing on tool using agents within its own stack, using its responses API, agents SDK, and prioritizing that tight integration and control within the OpenAI Azure kind of ecosystem, right? So the takeaway being, let me know if you agree with this, but basically Google is kind of, allowing enterprises for maximum interoperability and openness. But you want to choose OpenAI where you're looking for something that's vertically managed, right, with the agentic experience within, say, the Microsoft ecosystem.
I think what OpenAI is doing, Google's also done with the AI Studio, etc. So AI Studio has had things like Google Search as a tool in there, has had, code execution as a tool in there. I Really what O3 has done, it has taken some of those things, actually things that they've already had, but they've integrated it into the model much more. I think it's pretty much consensus that AGI is going to probably be much more agentic than just a single model. And I think OpenAI clearly, clearly understands that. And so what they've done with O3 is they're kind of starting to try and bake these tools into that model's ecosystem, so that from the start the model kind of knows that it's got these tools that it can use. I think both parties sort of realize this. OpenAI's O3 is really their foot forward in that.
Right. Yeah. And I think, yeah, they referred to about 600, up to 600 tools
Yeah.
that they were using in kind of one turn, right? Let's go to point number 3, right? Finally, getting to the actual model, right? It's important that, so we talked about the model not being the most important anymore, but it's really a crucial part of the overall scaffolding. It's the basis, right? And so it does feel, if you look at the metrics, right? We don't have to go over old news, but there's rough model parity, right? There's some trade-offs, right? So it looks like OpenAI is slightly better at coding, right? With its latest O3. If you're comparing it with the flagship Gemini 2.5 Pro, there's some other trade-offs, right? So for example, if OpenAI is emphasizing its reasoning, its coding prowess, and also kind of it does a lot of really cool things with imagery. It does have more hallucinations, and I think its card said it has 2 times the number of hallucinations than its predecessor O1. Right, and everyone has been talking about these hallucinations. Have you been looking at that, Sam? And would you agree that I've kind of summarized where these two models are?
So I think the whole idea of parity, yes, you're right. That the challenge with these models, Matt, is that as they get better, it becomes harder and harder for humans to actually judge them, right? And we're at the point now where, let's say a year ago, it was very easy for us to type certain things into them and just see like, oh, this is kind of so dumb that it doesn't understand this. Or now the things that they're usually not understanding are not sort of little riddles or things that a human would pick up quite easily. They're going to be either really technical kind of things in one specific domain. Now, my guess is that in certain very technical areas, they're actually quite different. Right. It could be that one of them is actually much better at medicine than the other one. I'm not a doctor. I don't really know. Right. And I kind of feel more and more it's going to become like that with these models. For people in enterprise, though, we, all the models are getting to be good enough to be able to do a lot of the things that you want. And as the models get better at the tool calling, as they get better at using these external sort of add-ons, that actually makes them, far better for this kind of stuff.
Right.
Now, it is interesting, like the whole sort of, hallucination and stuff like that. I haven't. I've played with the O3 model quite a bit. I it's I've been very impressed by it, right? Looking at it and stuff like that, and the O4 mini models as well. I've been very impressed by them. I kind of feel like, okay, I the challenge is going to be is how much do you trust it? Because if you don't trust it, right, even if it looks really good, you're going to start constantly questioning it, or you're going to have to be going and fact checking everything that it says,
Right.
and that's not going to be a practical sort of thing, right? People would rather go back to a slightly dumber model that isn't going to hallucinate as much.
Right.
So maybe Google's got a slight edge there with the Gemini Pro model, right? That could be something that Google you know can actually do better at.
Sam, that's a critical point. You made the point about how it's all, domain specific. We've all got to try it out. And that's actually the thing that's really important right now is trying these models out yourself and your use case. I, for example, have a very specific use case, right? When it comes to writing and it comes to analysis, right? And I've decided I've used both of them kind of religiously over the last week or so since I've been able to try these things on many exercises, right? I've sided with Gemini. I'll have to admit, just because of that reliability, it's just got a slight edge. I'm going to say they're really close, and I'm still trying them out. I find valuable input from from OpenAI's O3. But what I find on the edge is I'm trusting Gemini a little bit more. It's a little more structured, right? A little less innovative, perhaps, right? Is kind of the vibe that I'm getting. Gemini wouldn't even, allow me to use my own image, right? When I'm creating something fun. Whereas, OpenAI does, right? And those sorts of things start adding up, right? The risk that say an OpenAI allows you to take.
You're totally right that everyone should be trying these things out. On the whole, the benchmarks now are all the models are basically very close to each other for a lot of these benchmarks. So I kind of feel like most of those benchmarks don't really matter. The other thing too is you've got to think about how are you using the model. So one of the talks at ICLR today, which I found fascinating, was they were talking about using models for doing Kaggle competitions. And one of the things that they showed was it was not just the model that was the big impactor, it was which agent framework you were using with that model. So certain agent frameworks actually did better and scored better with a model that perhaps wasn't as good, wasn't the sort of number one model. So I think like this is where it becomes really challenging for someone in enterprise to decide, okay, well, what model are we going to use, or what models are we going to use? You probably should be using more than one.
Right.
And then also, what sort of frameworks are we going to be using to get the best out of that?
That's right.
That's where yeah, and this goes back to our ecosystem talk from last week, that everyone's now got their own framework to go along with their models.
Right. There was that great observation. I think maybe Ethan Mollick picked up on this, right? The professor at Wharton who's been tracking AI really closely. O3 is kind of hallucinating in part because it's actually anticipating or assuming it's using tools, right? So getting back to your point is that, if it actually had the tools, the clear prompting, right? And presumably the enterprise user can actually get this stuff together. Is it actually O3 is then works on steroids, right? But if you're taking those tools away and it's kind of anticipating the tools, and it's become clumsy. So yeah, there's a lot of these things in play. I think the other thing is, when I looked around at folks who were experimenting with tool use, I think Dan Shipper from Every2 is an example of someone who actually pushing O3 through the paces on several exercises after O3 was released, and had a blog post about it. But showing some really good performance there. So yeah, I think the takeaway there is, maybe Gemini for large context tasks still, right, because of its compute per intelligence per dollar and its predictability. But maybe O3 for some of these bleeding edge tool and kind of reasoning cases. Let's go on to point number 4, which is the enterprise fit and distribution, right? So Google has this integration depth workspace, Vertex AI, BigQuery, its database, right, for RAG. ChatGPT has this really wide consumer reach, right? And it has this ubiquity with the Microsoft 365 Copilot distribution, right? It's the partner there, and it actually is a default still from Microsoft is in the model there, right? So really ChatGPT being super accessible for Azure, Microsoft 365 companies, right, that are on that platform. So they had, Microsoft had a big lead there. And then OpenAI benefits from that massive consumer reach, right? That knowledge that consumers have about it, right? That image feature that's created, a couple 100 million more users. So it's now somewhere around 800 million monthly active users, right? So this idea that Google has that integration with its existing cloud customers, OpenAI has that broader reach, but easier access for Microsoft.
Each of them has got strengths, and each of them has got weaknesses as well. This is one of the things that OpenAI wanted to use Google search, right? That they talk about provider number one, which everyone seems to think is Bing, and probably is Bing, right? That they weren't that happy with provider number one, and they wanted to use Google search, and Google said no, right? So clearly Google has got a massive advantage in that sort of sphere. Like you said, OpenAI has got a massive advantage with ChatGPT. They were the first ones to do this on a consumer sort of app with a large scale. They've ridden that wave really well. They've benefited from that. They've also benefited from the fact that they let developers get on their platform pretty early, and build everything. And from that, they've been able to see what's getting traction, what's not.
Yeah. I mean, wondering at what point there is a flywheel that kicks in. Uh, it certainly doesn't seem to have happened yet, right? What I mean by that, a flywheel from that massive user base, it leads to a feedback loop that then accelerates right through agentic and AI intelligence. The
Okay,
improvement.
I disagree. It's happening. You
Okay.
don't get 800 million users without the flywheel sort of kicking in
Yeah, but
and
it's
working.
okay, yeah, but that's interesting. But isn't it just maybe a simple realization? Wow, our feature, right? The Ghibli Studio ability, a few weeks ago, had massive feedback for us. This is positive. So then we'll just double down on features, which they did, right? In terms of imagery, right? The O3 model being able to read, and understand images, and really focusing on that kind of consumer use case.
All these models have a personality, right? Whichever one you tend to use more of, you tend to gravitate towards. So I think OpenAI's got a huge advantage in that developers have been building on their models, and so all the developers' prompts are made for OpenAI models. When they're used with Gemini models, they don't usually work quite as well. It's not because the model is not good enough. It's just that the prompt itself needs to be fine tuned
Right.
to go with the other model. And so this is why OpenAI still, I think you'll find, is leading in the API stakes. Just because most people have kind of gotten used to them. We saw we haven't talked about the 4.1 models, and I understand, like, they are not the nice shiny thing that to talk about, but they're the catch-up models,
Right.
right? The 4.1 models were the catch-up models. They're the models that basically got up on par, got pricing roughly on par with Gemini. And I kind of feel with all these things, once pricing gets to a certain amount, it probably doesn't matter that much whether this company is slightly cheaper or that company is slightly more or something like that.
Right.
It's going to become more about convenience, more about just like, okay, we've already got a deal going with OpenAI. We're already using their models. Okay, let's just stick to that for now.
You make a good point about the API and the feedback loop, right? The prompts already being used by enterprise, and so let's keep things simple. But Google is trying to make a point that it has 2 billion plus users across like these 7 massive apps, right? Maps, search, right? You have YouTube, and they're using Gemini and all of these right behind the scenes. I was asking Mark Lohmeyer, right, who's their lead on compute. He was talking about this great feedback loop that they have from these apps that no one else has in terms of how AI is being used. But it was hard for him to pin down exactly how that was then being put back
Wait,
into the wisdom of the ecosystem. And you made a really good counterpoint that it's actually the API, the company's actually using it. And it sounds like I'm kind of bearish on OpenAI. I'm not. I mean, I've loved the product, but I'm just looking at the facts, right? Is that it had this board coup. It's been all over the place. It's got lawsuits in terms of its mission. It was nonprofit. It's trying to move into for profit. There's a lot of question marks around Sam Altman's character, right? A lot of people have left the company, and yeah, it happens with all successful businesses that have been running as long as it has. But I'm looking at the comparison with Google, right? It's like it's Sundar Pichai, who kind of eschews kind of the limelight, behind the scenes, but they plod along, working for you, right? When they started the Google Cloud, right? Everyone was wondering if it was gonna last. And I know there's some counterexamples of Google, they'll shut things down, but they have stuck with it, right? Google Cloud, right? Despite being number 3 and a distant number 3, they have kept moving, and they are operating and seem to have a little bit more reliability there in terms of its roadmap. Would you agree with that? I want you to push back if you disagree.
I disagree. Because I think, okay, look, OpenAI ain't going anywhere, right? Sam Altman's pretty much, taken out any competition he had in the board, etc. And even if OpenAI was to, lose all these lawsuits and stuff, you've got to think that Microsoft is just going to pick up all that tech and run with it. the companies that are using this, the amount of agent pilots in the first quarter this year has gone up massively. All this sort of stuff is pointing that OpenAI and Google are both on a riding this wave, and this wave is getting bigger. The question is anyone else on that wave? Maybe Anthropic.
I think that's a valid pushback, and it actually brings up a news report. I think that was just broke. I'm not sure if you saw it, Sam, right as we're recording here, but I think it was the information that released some inside projections from OpenAI that it's going to hit a revenue of $125 billion, right, up from something like 13 billion in 2025, but 125 billion by 2029, right? In just like 4 years. So if those are their latest internal projections, then clearly they feel they're onto something. And I think there was one comment out there that basically, it certainly hasn't hit AGI by 2029 yet, because its revenue would be much more than that. So there's always going to be these questions around OpenAI because of its ambition, because of the kind of the sheer action around its ecosystem. But yeah, good conversation. Thanks, Sam. And we'll see what happens over the next few weeks.
Lots more to happen, Matt. Talk to you again soon.